In the book Pirkei Avot, an ancient source of Jewish wisdom, we receive a saying from Rabbi Akiva. Everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted, and the world is judged with goodness, and everything is in accordance with the preponderance of works. The story of Joseph illustrates these themes and can be read as a warning to us all. At the beginning of Joseph's story, the narrator tells us that God was with Joseph, but only in moments when Joseph was at his most vulnerable. When he was sold down to Egypt, when he attained success in the powerful courtier Potiphar's house, only to end up in prison, our narrator tells us that God was with Joseph, and God made Joseph successful. As we reach the end of the Joseph story, this dynamic changes. We see Joseph himself say over and over again that God is acting through him. But never does the narrator confirm this. And even earlier in the story, we are never shown God speaking directly to Joseph, especially not in the way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob spoke with God. So how could Joseph have possibly known this to be true? When we return to Rabbi Akiva's saying, we can see within Joseph's actions and words the belief that God controls the events of the world, that all is for good, even when Joseph himself was suffering. Who hasn't tried to comfort themselves or someone else by saying something to the effect of, everything happens for a reason? John Welwood, a famous psychotherapist, coined the term spiritual bypassing to encapsulate when this kind of belief structure becomes dangerous and perhaps harmful. He said, spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. Trying to move beyond our psychological and emotional issues by sidestepping them is dangerous. It leads to a conceptual, one-sided kind of spirituality where one pole of life is elevated at the expense of its opposite. Absolute truth is favored over relative truth, the impersonal over the personal, emptiness over form, transcendence over embodiment, and detachment over feeling. Ultimately, Rabbi Akiva's statement is a more complex version of this, stating that God knows all, but we still have freedom of choice. That goodness takes precedence. That simply being more bad or more good than bad means that we're doing all right. It's a comforting worldview. It adds a sense of purpose to suffering, which can provide our minds a sense of closure on previous trauma. For instance, had Joseph not been thrown into the pit and sold into slavery and then wrongfully accused of sexual violence and thrown into prison, he would never have become vizier, and his brothers and family never would have been able to flee to Egypt to escape the famine. And we wouldn't be here today being Jewish. So everything happens for a reason, right? We also know that earlier in the story, Joseph famously angered his family through sharing his grandiose dreams, which had his entire family bowing down to him. Can we not maybe see an echo of this childish pomposity in his declaration of God having orchestrated all of these events around him? And does it not lead him to overreaching with his power as vizier and turning the entirety of Egypt into indentured servants? What if Joseph's viewpoint provides, through spiritual bypass, premature closure? What if it is used to paste over his unhealed wounds? Let us for a moment imagine having suffered the traumas and harms that Joseph suffered in his youth. How would that affect your ability to trust people? How would that affect your care for others? How would it affect your outlook on what is most important in your life? Horrific betrayal by family, horrific betrayal by those who have power over you, being forgotten in a prison cell by someone you helped to free. I can imagine this creating a person almost entirely focused on protecting themselves and consolidating power so that they cannot be hurt again. When we combine this with his already displayed penchant towards self-aggrandizement, we see not only a hero of the Jewish people, but also a man corrupted by power. Power which had leached into his unresolved historical wounds and attached itself to the least palatable of his personality traits. His spiritual bypass opened him up to corruption. This combination created a man who claims God is acting through him and uses his power to turn all of his citizens into indentured servants, while giving his family free reign over the richest land in Egypt. That is, spiritual bypass validates the blessings he counts for himself and led him to further believe that all he attained was because God has marked him as special through his suffering. Any of us could fall into this trap. So how do we know when we go too far? One of the most central Jewish practices, saying blessings over all kinds of experiences, is all about helping us to feel God in our day-to-day experiences. Problems arise when we begin to think we ourselves are especially chosen for these blessings due to our previous suffering, and therefore all of our actions are equally gifts from God to the world. As Joseph says to his brother, "Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me here. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And God has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of all his household, and ruler over the whole land of Egypt." As I've said before, Joseph eventually uses this power to centralize all property and land in Egypt under Pharaoh. In his telling, this act of turning an entire country to indentured servitude is, in fact, God's plan. I would, though, bring back the first part of Rabbi Akiva's statement. Everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is given. Which is to say, perhaps God foresaw this possibility, but it was not an inevitability. It was Joseph's choice. And if all is based on the preponderance of deeds, then Joseph's deeds, which one could argue led to the eventual enslavement of the Israelites centuries later, must be understood as the effects of his spiritual bypass. So how do we avoid falling into the same trap Joseph fell into? Once again, the act of blessing. We have a traditional blessing formula, familiar to most Jews, beginning with Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe. And then concluding by naming the thing we have encountered as a blessing or experienced as having happened by the grace of God, usually in a poetic way that expands the importance of this experience. This is such an important practice, our sages teach. Anyone who derives benefit from this world without a blessing, it is as if he stole from God and the community of Israel. Joseph, unfortunately, didn't have the benefit of the collective wisdom of the millennia of our people to help guide him through his use of power. And due to the effects of his overreach, he was influenced by that spiritual bypass to not deal with the traumas of his past. And so our ancestors were condemned to hundreds of years of slavery. May we today, in our time, make sure to focus on the blessings that come our way daily, to reflect on our own sense of destiny, our own narratives of blessings and curses, and steer clear of the very human tendency for spiritual bypass. Shabbat Shalom.